The moment I stepped through those double doors, the room went dead silent. Not the respectful kind of silence you expect at a funeral. The kind that freezes people in place. Heads turned slowly. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. A glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the floor, but nobody reacted to it. Because I was supposed to be dead. And yet, there I was, standing at the back of the room, wearing the same black suit I had worn just hours earlier when I watched them all gather without me. My family, my so-called friends, and the people who, just a few days ago, were crying over my casket while secretly celebrating something else entirely. I didn't speak. I didn't move at first. I just looked at them, un by un, watching their faces shift from grief to confusion to pure terror. Because in that moment, they realized something no one had prepared for. I wasn't missing. I wasn't gone. I had been watching everything. My name is Daniel Reyes. And 3 days before this moment, I was officially declared dead. Or at least, that's what they told everyone. The version of me that the world accepted was simple. A tragic accident, a closed case, a life cut short too soon. But the truth behind that accident was anything but simple. And the people responsible for arranging my funeral, they weren't mourning me. They were celebrating. It started months earlier, with subtle shifts I didn't fully understand at the time. I worked as a logistics coordinator for a mid-sized corporate firm. Nothing glamorous, nothing flashy, just steady, predictable work that paid the bills and kept me under the radar. I wasn't loud. I wasn't confrontational. I showed up, did my job, and went home. That was my routine. But my family, they never saw me as just Daniel the employee. To them, I was something else entirely. An opportunity. My older brother, Marcus, had always been the ambitious one. The one who needed to win. The one who couldn't stand the idea of me having anything he didn't control or understand. Growing up, that meant competition over everything. Grades, attention, respect. But as adults, that competition became something darker. It became financial, strategic, personnel, especially after our parents passed away and left behind a small but significant inheritance. That's when things changed. Not overnight, but slowly, subtly, pieces began shifting into place. Marcus started asking more questions about my finances, about my job stability, about my future plans. At first, it seemed like concern. Looking back now, it was reconnaissance. Around the same time, my Aunt Linda began inserting herself more into my life. She had always been the family organizer, the one who stayed neutral during conflicts. Or so I thought. She started inviting me to dinners more frequently, checking in on me, offering advice I didn't ask for. Make sure your paperwork is in order, she once told me casually over coffee. At the time, I laughed it off. Now I realize that wasn't casual at all. That was preparation. The shift became impossible to ignore after a particular conversation I had with Marcus. We were at my apartment. He was sitting across from me, casually scrolling on his phone, acting like he was just passing time. Then he said something that stuck with me. You ever think about what happens if something happens to you? I remember looking up from my laptop. Like what? He shrugged. Accidents, unexpected stuff, life insurance, assets, the usual. I laughed at the time, but his tone wasn't joking. Not really. It felt rehearsed. Like he had asked himself that same question and already liked the answers. A week later, things escalated. I started noticing small inconsistencies at work. Emails that were redirected. Requests that were lost in the system. Confusion from colleagues who suddenly treated me differently. Then came the meeting. My supervisor called me into his office and explained that there had been a serious internal concern raised about my employment. He wouldn't tell me who reported it, but the accusations were vague, yet damaging enough to trigger an internal review. At the time, I didn't understand why. Now I do. They were creating a paper trail, building a narrative, setting the stage. 3 days before the funeral, everything came to a head. I remember that morning clearly. It was unusually quiet. No message, no calls, just a strange sense that something wasn't right. I left my apartment around 9 a.m. to head to work, but halfway there I noticed a car following me. Same route, same turns, same distance. At first I dismissed it as coincidence, but after 3 blocks, it was still there. That's when I changed direction, and the car followed. My pulse started to rise. I took a sudden turn into a side street, then parked quickly and stepped out. The car slowed, then drove past me without stopping. No eye contact, no reaction, just gone. But something about that moment told me I was being watched. Not randomly, deliberately. That same evening, everything went silent. My phone stopped receiving messages. Calls dropped. Emails delayed. Even my access to work systems began failing. It felt like I was being slowly cut off from everything at once. And then, at around midnight, the news broke. Or rather, the version of the news they wanted the world to see. A police report, an incident, a confirmed fatality. My name, my identity, declared gone. I didn't see the report myself at first, but Marcus did, and so did Linda. And within hours, the entire family network had already shifted into motion. Messages were sent, calls were made, arrangements began. And just like that, I was no longer Daniel Reyes, the person. I had become Daniel Reyes, the memory. The next 2 days blurred together in ways I can barely describe. From what I later discovered, those days were filled with activity behind the scenes. Legal filings, insurance notifications, asset discussions, and, most importantly, control. Because with my death officially recognized, certain things could be accessed, transferred, or manipulated. Things that required my absence. Permanent absence. But there was one thing they didn't account for. One critical detail that they overlooked in their entire plan. Me. Not the version of me they erased. Not the version they reported. The version that was still very much alive and very much paying attention. I didn't confront them immediately. I didn't call anyone. I didn't reveal myself. Instead, I disappeared from their radar completely. I stayed quiet. I observed. I gathered information. And what I found confirmed everything I suspected. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't grief gone wrong. This was coordinated, calculated, and deeply intentional. The funeral was scheduled for the third day, a private service. Family only, with a few invited guests. People who, in their eyes, mattered enough to witness the final chapter of my life. And by the time that day arrived, everything was in place. The flowers were arranged, the invitations were sent, the speeches were prepared, and the lies were ready to be told in front of an audience. I arrived at the venue 1 hour early, not as Daniel Reyes, not as a ghost, but as someone who had spent the last 72 hours learning exactly how far this had gone. From outside the building, I could hear faint movement inside, voices, footsteps, the low hum of conversation as people began to gather. Black attire, somber expressions, standard funeral behavior. Except this wasn't standard. Not even close. I stood there for a moment just watching the entrance, taking everything in. The same people who had spoken about me in past tense, the same faces that had already accepted my absence, were now preparing to say goodbye. Officially, permanently. And that's when I made my decision. I wasn't going to let this pass quietly. I wasn't going to let them control the narrative of my own existence. If they wanted a funeral, I was going to give them one, but not the one they expected. I adjusted my suit, took a breath, and stepped forward, through the doors, into the room where everyone believed I no longer existed. The silence that followed wasn't accidental. It was immediate, heavy, unavoidable. Every eye in the room shifted toward me at the exact same time. Faces drained of color, mouths slightly open, hands frozen mid-motion. Because standing there, in full view of everyone, was the man they had already buried. And somewhere in that room, Marcus was sitting near the front, watching me like he had just seen a ghost. But I wasn't a ghost. Not to him. Not anymore. Because the moment our eyes locked, I saw something in his expression that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't surprise. This wasn't confusion. This was fear. Pure, immediate fear. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. This funeral wasn't just about saying goodbye. It was about closing a chapter, permanently. For them, because whatever they had planned was about to be exposed. And they had absolutely no idea how close they already were to losing control. The moment Marcus saw me, his entire posture changed. Not shock, not relief, Control. That's what he lost. Just for a split second, but it was enough for me to notice. While everyone else in the room was still frozen in confusion, Marcus leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing, like he was recalculating something in real time. Like he had already processed the fact that I was here and was now trying to figure out what to do next. That reaction told me more than any confession ever could. He wasn't surprised I was alive. He was surprised I showed up now. I didn't move further into the room. Not yet. I stayed near the entrance, letting the silence stretch. Whispers started spreading like wildfire. Is that him? No, that's impossible. Someone call. Voices overlapped, growing louder, more chaotic. A few people stood up. Others instinctively leaned back, as if distance alone could protect them from whatever this was. But I wasn't there to explain myself immediately. I was there to watch, to confirm, to understand how deep this went. And then I saw her, Linda, my aunt, sitting mid-row, hands clasped tightly together, eyes wide but not panicked, calculating. Unlike the others, her reaction wasn't pure shock. It was controlled fear, the kind that comes from someone who already knows part of the truth but didn't expect to be confronted with it this soon. Her gaze met mine briefly, and in that instant, she looked away. That was enough confirmation. She knew more than she ever admitted. I finally took a step forward, then another. My footsteps echoed slightly across the polished floor, cutting through the murmurs. Every movement I made shifted the atmosphere further into uncertainty. People weren't just reacting anymore. They were waiting for an explanation. For an explanation I had no intention of giving just yet. Because before I said a single word, I needed proof. The funeral director standing near the front looked completely unprepared for this situation. He stepped forward hesitantly, adjusting his tie. Sir, this must be some kind of misunderstanding. His voice trailed off as he looked directly at me. There was no misunderstanding. Not anymore. But I didn't respond to him. Instead, I scanned the room again, looking at faces, reading reactions, cataloging everything. I noticed something else now that I was inside. This wasn't just a funeral. It was structured, intentionnel. The seating arrangement wasn't random. Certain individuals were placed closer to the front. Others grouped together subtly. Legal-looking individuals sat together. Family members clustered in specific zones. Even the guest list seemed curated. This wasn't just about mourning. This was about presence. Witnessing something, recording something, finalizing something. My attention shifted back to Marcus. He hadn't moved from his seat, but now he was watching me differently. Not like someone seeing a ghost, but like someone evaluating risk. He leaned over slightly toward the man next to him and whispered something quickly. The man nodded, then reached into his pocket. That caught my attention, because that gesture wasn't emotional. It was procedural. I took another step forward. Mind if I take a seat? I said calmly, my voice cutting through the noise. That alone caused several people to gasp again. The idea that I was speaking casually at my own funeral broke whatever fragile sense of normalcy remained. The funeral director hesitated, then nodded awkwardly. Of course, we can adjust, but I didn't sit yet. Instead, I walked slowly down the aisle, passing rows of people who either avoided eye contact or stared openly in disbelief. Some looked guilty, others confused. A few looked terrified, and a small number looked like they were waiting for instructions. That last group mattered the most. As I moved closer to the front, I could hear fragments of whispered conversations. This can't be real. Did someone make a mistake? Is this a setup? Why is he here now? No one had an answer, but I did. I just wasn't ready to give it yet. I stopped a few feet away from the front row, right behind Marcus. He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge me. He stayed facing forward, his hands resting calmly on his knees. But I could see the tension in his shoulders. He was listening, waiting, calculating. Marcus, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried. He paused for a second, then slowly turned his head. Our eyes met again. This time, there was no shock left in his expression. Only something colder, measured, controlled. Daniel, he replied evenly. Not a question, not disbelief, just acknowledgement. That was when I knew for sure. He had already accepted this moment, which meant he had already prepared for it. I guess this is unexpected, I said, keeping my tone neutral. A few people nearby leaned in, trying to catch every word. Marcus gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Unexpected isn't the word I'd use. That response landed differently. Not defensive, not panicked, prepared. Before I could respond, the funeral director stepped forward again, visibly uncomfortable. Ladies and gentlemen, we may need to pause proceedings momentarily while we clarify the situation. But Marcus raised a hand slightly. No need. That stopped him. Marcus then stood up slowly. Now he had everyone's attention again, including mine. If everyone could remain seated, Marcus said, turning slightly to address the room. This will only take a moment. His tone was calm, commanding, like he had already taken control of the room's attention. People hesitated, then slowly complied. The chaos began to settle not because the confusion was resolved, but because Marcus had redirected it. That told me something important. He was still trying to control the environment. Even now, Marcus turned back to me. "You're early," he said. That was the first real crack in his composure. Not fear, not panic, but timing. He hadn't expected me to arrive at this exact moment, which meant whatever he had planned likely depended on specific timing, and my early arrival disrupted that. Early for what? I asked. I already knew the answer would matter. Marcus studied me for a moment, then glanced briefly toward Linda, then back at me. "Your absence was supposed to be consistent," he said carefully. That phrase stuck. Consistent. Not final. Not permanent. Consistent. A small shift in perspective clicked into place. This wasn't just about declaring me dead. It was about maintaining that status long enough to complete something. Something that required my continued absence. And now that I was here, that process was compromised. I took another step closer. "Let's talk outside," Marcus said quietly. Not a request, a suggestion, but also a warning. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a funeral anymore. This was a controlled situation that was starting to spiral. Before I could respond, Linda suddenly stood up from her seat. "Marcus, wait." Her voice trembled slightly. That was the first genuine emotion I had seen from her. Not controlled, not calculated, unstably. Marcus didn't look at her. "Stay seated," he said firmly. And she did. That interaction confirmed something else. Marcus wasn't just involved. He was leading. I exhaled slowly. "Fine," I said. And for a brief moment, it looked like I was agreeing to step outside. But that wasn't my intention. Because as I shifted my stance slightly, I noticed something else. The man who had reached into his pocket earlier, he was now holding a phone. And he was recording. That changed everything. This wasn't just a private moment anymore. It was being documented, captured, possibly transmitted, which meant this confrontation had an audience beyond the room. And Marcus knew it, because instead of stopping it, he allowed it, which meant this wasn't just about reacting. It was about controlling perception. I stopped walking, looked directly at Marcus again. "Before we go anywhere," I said, loud enough for the room to hear, "there's something I want to ask." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Go ahead." I paused, let the silence settle again, then said, "How long did you think this would stay hidden?" The room went completely still, because that question wasn't random. It implied something deeper, something planned, something discovered. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He held my gaze. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an innocent one, a knowing smile. "You came here sooner than expected," he said quietly. "And that changes things." That's when I realized this wasn't the beginning of the confrontation. It was the moment both sides understood that the confrontation was already inevitable. And whatever came next would no longer be controlled behind closed doors. The moment I saw that folder again, everything in my head went quiet. Same color, same thickness, same clipped edges. But this time, it was being passed between two men I didn't recognize, both dressed in dark suits, both standing near the back of the room like they belonged there. And most importantly, both of them were watching Marcus for direction. Not me. That told me everything. This wasn't just a family situation anymore. This was coordinated, structured, and whatever was inside that folder had already been prepared long before I walked into this room. Marcus noticed where my attention shifted. For the first time since I arrived, his expression tightened slightly. Not fear, not panic, but recognition that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see. He didn't react outwardly, though. Instead, he adjusted his stance and turned slightly toward the room. "Everyone," Marcus said calmly, raising his voice just enough to regain control. "I understand this is confusing." His tone was steady again, composed, back in control of the narrative. At least, he thought he was. People in the room started settling back into their seats. Not because the situation was resolved, but because Marcus spoke like someone who expected to be listened to. That's the kind of presence he had always tried to build. Authority through composure, control through silence. But now that I was here, that control was being challenged in real time. I stepped forward again. Not aggressively, not suddenly, just enough to shift attention back to me. "You've been preparing for this," I said, looking directly at Marcus. Not a question, a statement. Marcus didn't deny it. He simply replied, "We've been handling matters based on the information we had." Information, I repeated. That word mattered, because it suggested documentation. Records, proof. I turned slightly toward the front row, scanning faces. Some people avoided my gaze. Others stared openly. A few leaned toward each other, whispering rapidly. The tension in the room had shifted from confusion to anticipation. People weren't just reacting anymore. They were waiting for something to happen. Then I spoke louder. "Since we're all here," I said, "I think it's important we clarify a few things." That immediately got everyone's attention. Even Marcus looked at me more directly now. "You were declared dead," Marcus said carefully. "There are legal proceedings that followed that declaration." His tone was deliberate. He was trying to anchor the conversation in legality, process, authority. "Declared," I repeated. I nodded slightly. "By who?" That question hung in the air. Because, while he had an answer, it wasn't the one he wanted to reveal in front of everyone. Before Marcus could respond, one of the men in the back, the one holding the folder, stepped forward slightly and handed it to someone sitting near the aisle. The movement didn't go unnoticed. Several people tracked it, including me. "Let's proceed," Marcus said quickly, trying to redirect attention. But it was too late. Something was already in motion. I took another step forward, and then another, until I was standing closer to the center aisle, within full view of everyone. "I didn't come here by accident," I said. "My death wasn't what you told people it was." That statement shifted the energy in the room again. People started reacting more visibly now. Some leaned forward. Others straightened in their seats. The whispers grew louder. Marcus exhaled slowly, then said, "Daniel, this isn't the place." But I shook my head. It's exactly the place. Because this wasn't just a funeral anymore. It was the only stage where everything they had done could be exposed at once. In front of witnesses. In front of people who had been told a false story. I turned slightly toward the audience. "Some of you were invited here under the assumption that you were attending a final goodbye." I paused. "But that assumption is based on a narrative that isn't complete." That's when the room shifted again. People started looking at each other. Uncertainty spreading. Linda stood up again, this time more abruptly. "Daniel, what are you saying?" she asked, her voice noticeably tense. This time there was no composure in her tone, no control, just pressure. I looked at her directly. "I'm saying the version of events you've all been given doesn't match reality." Silence followed, heavier this time. Marcus stepped forward slightly. "Then clarify reality," he said. That was a challenge. Direct. Intentional. He was forcing me to reveal what I knew. On his terms. I nodded once, then reached into my inner jacket pocket. Slowly, deliberately, every movement visible. The room held its breath. I pulled out a small device, a recording unit, and held it up. "This is part of reality," I said. Then I pressed play. The device emitted a voice. Clear. Recognizable. Marcus's voice. From a prior conversation. "We just need the declaration to go through cleanly. Once that's in place, everything else becomes manageable." Gasps rippled through the room. People looked at Marcus immediately. His expression didn't break, but his eyes sharpened. The recording continued. Another voice. A second voice I recognized as Linda's. "Once the documentation is processed, access becomes straightforward." That was enough. Whispers turned into audible reactions. People began realizing this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something structured, planned. Marcus raised his hand sharply. Turn that off. His voice carried more force now. Not calm anymore. Controlled urgency. But I didn't stop it immediately. Instead, I let it play for a few more seconds. Let the room absorb it. Let the reactions build. Then I stopped it and looked back at him. You didn't expect me to have copies, I said quietly. Marcus didn't respond right away, because now the balance had shifted. He stepped closer to me, lowered his voice. This isn't something you want to escalate in public. That wasn't a warning. It was confirmation. I met his gaze. It already is public. And that was the moment everything changed. Because at that exact time, a door at the back of the room opened again. 2 more individuals entered. This time, not part of the family, not part of the guests. They were carrying credentials, official ones. A subtle shift moved through the room as people noticed them. Whispers again. Question. Speculation. One of the new arrivals stepped forward and spoke clearly. We've been reviewing documentation related to this case. The room went silent again. Marcus turned slightly. This is a private service. But the man shook his head. Not anymore. That statement confirmed what I had suspected. This situation had extended beyond a family matter. It had reached a level where external parties were now involved. And based on their presence, things were no longer under Marcus's control. The man continued. There are inconsistencies in the reported status of the individual declared deceased. He looked at me, then back at the room. And based on preliminary findings, this situation requires clarification. People started reacting more strongly now. Phones came out. Some guests began recording. Others stood up to leave. The room was no longer a controlled environment. It was unraveling. Marcus clenched his jaw slightly. This was the first visible sign of strain. Not fear, but loss of containment. Linda covered her mouth with her hand, her breathing uneven. She was no longer composed at all. The situation had moved beyond her ability to manage. I took a breath, then spoke one final time. I didn't come here to interrupt a funeral. I paused. I came here to correct one. The room erupted into overlapping reactions. Confusion, shock, arguments, question. And in the middle of all that chaos, Marcus stood still, watching me, trying to process how his carefully structured plan had collapsed in real time. He leaned slightly toward me and said in a low voice, "This isn't over." I nodded. I know, because what had just happened here wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of consequences. The truth had been exposed in front of witnesses. Documents were being questioned. Voices were being recorded. And control had finally slipped out of his hands. As the room continued to break apart into noise and movement, I stepped back slightly, not in retreat, but in closure, because for the first time since I was declared dead, I was no longer invisible. And as people began leaving the room in a mix of disbelief and panic, I noticed one final detail. Marcus wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. He was looking at me, not with anger, not with denial, but with something far more dangerous, understanding. As he slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, I caught a glimpse of the screen and saw a message already typed out, addressed to someone named Legal, with one line that read, "Activate contingency." And in that moment, I realized this wasn't the end of his plan. It was the moment he moved to the next phase.